Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emanuel, I'm a 737 pilot and a member of PMDG's tech team. Today let's cover part 2 of our winter operations series, and in this video we will deal with handling the aircraft on the ground, some special procedures you need to carry out, and finally we are going to talk about cold temperature altimeter errors. We will actually start with the latter one because it is something we need to do in the pre-flight procedure as well as in the descent preparation while we are setting our airplane up. I did not cover this one in the previous episode because it did not directly relate to DN anti-icing, which the previous episode was immediately about. First of all, if you haven't seen the previous episode called Winter Operations Anti and De-icing, then I would recommend you to do that one before you view this one. But let's go straight ahead and dive right into it. When the air is cold, the air is going to be contracting, versus when the air is warm, it is going to be extending. Now, that is going to lead to your altimeter reading incorrectly, because altimeters are calibrated for an ICAO standard atmosphere. In winter, you are going to be lower than your altimeter reads, while in summer, in warm temperatures, you are going to be higher than your altimeter actually reads. So to summarize this one, if the temperature is below the ICAO standard atmosphere, then your altimeter is going to tell you that you're at a higher altitude than you actually are. Versus if the temperature is warmer than ICAO standard atmosphere, your altimeter is going to tell you that you are lower than you actually are. Now, as you can imagine, this is quite a problem when you are operating in winter conditions, as it means that you will be flying lower than your altimeter indicates. Do note that only the barometric altimeter is affected, the radio altimeter is not affected by this. The colder it is, the stronger this error is going to be, and we can have a look at it by looking at the cold temperature altimeter correction table, which you can find in the supplementary procedures in the 737 AFCOM, as well as any other Boeing AFCOM, and I'm sure that Airbus and other manufacturers will have an equivalent table available. So, how do we actually read the table? On the left side we can see the outside air temperature at the airport in degrees centigrade, while on the upper side we can see the altitude above the altimeter referenced source, which usually is the airport. So what does that actually mean, and how do we need to apply it? This means that when we have, for example, a height of 1,000 feet above an airport where you have 0 degrees, your actual altitude is going to be 60 feet lower than the indicated altitude on the altimeter. Transversely, in order to fly 1,000 feet above that airport, you have to fly 1,020 feet on the altimeter above that airport. Now that may not sound a lot, but let's have a look into a couple following cases. Let's say, for example, you are flying an ILS down to a minimum of 200 feet. You can see that your altimeter is going to overread by 20 feet. That means that you have to add 20 feet to the altimeter as, or 20 feet to your barometric minimums as applicable. Once again, this does not apply to radio minimums, so if you are using a radio minimum, do not correct for that. Now, let's have a practical look into how these altitude corrections need to be applied on your departure. And we will do that by having a look into the departure that we are planned to fly. We have planned the Kumake 1 Quebec departure from Cologne Airport, runway 14 left, and we can see there are a couple of altitude restrictions on this one. In the FMC we have runway 14 left and the Kumake 1 Quebec departure. And here are our altitude restrictions. Now, first of all, which altitudes do we need to correct? We need to correct any altitude that is below the corrected MSA. So if we have a look at the chart, we can see the MSA is 3,800 feet all around the airport, and the airport elevation is 302 feet. In other words, we need to first correct the MSA and then determine which altitudes we do need to correct. So looking at the cold altitude correction table once again, we can see that at the moment we have a temperature of -5 degrees, as we can see up here on the engine display, and Therefore, we need to apply approximately the middle between the two tables. Now, in order to make our life simpler, let's simply use the tables for -10 degrees, as that is going to provide greater safety margin. Looking at the MSA and the airport elevation then, as we can see up here, we have approximately 3,500 feet for our height of the MSA above the airport. So that is MSA minus airport elevation. And now looking at the cold altitude correction table, we can see it only goes to 3,000 feet above the altimeter reference source, which is 290 feet, but we can simply add the additional 50 feet that we see for the 500 feet section over there. So we take 290 plus 50 as the altimeter under reading. So we need to add 340 feet to our MSA. If we have a look into the chart once again, we can see 3,800 plus 340 gives us an MSA rounded up of 4,200 feet. In other words, any altitude that is below 4,200 needs to be corrected. So let's work our way from here into the restrictions that we have on our departure. We can see our first altitude restriction is 1,120 feet, minus the airport elevation gives you roughly 800 feet. Looking into the table, for 800 feet we need to add 80 feet to our altitude restriction. In other words, the first restriction is Delta Kilo 920, which used to be 1,120, is now going to become 1,200 feet or above. So we are going to enter that. Let's continue with the second one. We have 1,640, which roughly equates to 1,300 feet. Looking into the table, we can either use the 1,000 foot value and add the 300 foot value, which would end up at 130 feet, or you could just take round about the middle between the 1,000 and 1,500, which would be 125, so round about again 130. So we are going to add 130 feet to that, which is going to make it 1,770 feet. The next one, 3,000 feet, roughly equates to 2,700, but let's make our life easy and we simply take the 3,000 foot value, so we are going to add 290 feet to that, so our restriction at Delta Kilo 922 becomes 3,290 feet. We execute this, and this is our cold temperature corrections complete for our departure. Be aware that you need to do the very same thing on your approach, so for the approach, once again, determine the corrected MSA, and then correct any altitude that is below this, including your minima and your missed approach altitude if that is below the corrected MSA as well. So, that is our setup complete for this departure. I have already shown you the pushback procedures in the previous tutorial, so we will just go ahead and beam ourselves forward to the position where the de-icing, anti-icing and the pushback is complete, and I see you again on the taxiway in a few moments. Our thumbs up signal is received, our engines are started, and we have seen the gear pin. That means we can continue with our normal procedures. We have completed our pushback, the engines are started, and with the clear signal received, we can now carry out our before taxi procedures. But be aware of a couple differences. First of all, let's talk about usage of anti-ice on the ground. When you start the before taxi procedure, the engine anti-ice needs to be turned on whenever the temperature is 10 degrees or less and there is visible precipitation. And as we can see, there is definitely visible precipitation at the moment. That means we need to turn on the engine anti-ice. However, be careful with your wing anti-ice. If your aircraft has been de-iced using a Type 2 or Type 4 de-icing fluid, do not turn on the wing anti-ice, as that is going to affect the effectiveness or the quality of the de-icing fluid, and therefore invalidates your holdover times. Let's go ahead and carry out the before taxi procedure. The generators are on, APU is off, start switch is in the continuous, Probe heat should be on already if you had encountered freezing conditions on the ground. Engine anti-ice only, as we have de-iced our aircraft prior to pushback. If the aircraft has not been de-iced, always use the wing anti-ice prior to taxi out on the ground when you're using the engine anti-ice as well. Tax auto. Isolation of auto. And APU bleed off. But be aware that at least 1 minute should have been passed before you switch on the packs after your anti-icing. Now comes the big question of the flaps. And the flaps should only be extended when there is no delay anticipated for takeoff, when there is freezing precipitation. So as we can see right now, we definitely have freezing precipitation, so we are going to keep our flaps up for the taxi. If there was no freezing precipitation present at the moment and the aircraft has been subjected to freezing conditions on a prolonged stop, meaning greater than 45 minutes from the time that the flaps have been retracted after your landing, then the flaps should be checked for full travel, which means moving the flap lever from up to 40, closely watching the gauge as the flaps extend, and if the flaps should stop at any position, the flap lever should be moved immediately to that particular position. Once the flaps are extended to 40, you're going to retract them again, in case you have to taxi above contaminated surfaces. So that means if you're taxiing, for example, with freezing conditions right now, or if there is snow on the ground, as there definitely is, as we can see outside the airplane right now. However, as we currently do have freezing precipitation, we're going to leave the flaps up for taxi, as otherwise that freezing precipitation could enter the flap cavities and accumulate on positions where it is definitely not supposed to be, for example the flap drives. Also be aware, with the slats extended, ice could accumulate on the slats, which once again you do definitely not want over there. The same goes for the flight control track. In case the aircraft is exposed to freezing precipitation as it is at the moment, we are going to delay the flight control track until we reach our runway holding point and there is no further delay expected for takeoff. In my airline, in order to be absolutely certain that you don't forget that your airplane is not configured for taxi, the first officer would clip the winter operations checklist to the decal checklist on the control column up here, so that you absolutely have it inside and that you are aware that your aircraft is not configured for takeoff. So, for now the flaps are going to stay up. We will delay our flight control track and we carry out our recall, and then we run the before taxi checklist freezing conditions, which is going to take account of the our airplane configuration not being in the same configuration where you would expect it normally to be. So let's talk about taxi procedures then. If the surfaces are contaminated, you should limit your taxi speed to 5 knots. So that is an awfully slow taxi. Also be aware, if your airplane is on a self-maneuvering stand, so a stand where you do not do a pushback, it might need a greater than normal thrust to get your airplane moving, because the wheels might be frozen to the ground. In our case, we did do a pushback, so let's go ahead, turn on the lights, release the parking brake, and off we go. In this configuration, do not carry out the takeoff configuration check, as the flaps are not extended and therefore the takeoff configuration warning is definitely going to sound. And here we go, slowly but steadily, and you can see we do need quite a bit more thrust than usual. Five knots might seem like an awfully slow taxi speed, But be aware that depending on the surface condition of the aprons and taxiways that you are taxiing over, even 5 knots might be too fast. So be aware 5 knots is a limit, not a target. And personally, I have already experienced aprons being so slippery that even at 2 knots the airplane started skidding and in turns just kept going straight. Well, sideways in those situations there. So, 5 knots, that's our maximum taxi speed under these conditions. Looking at it from the outside, however, you can see why this speed is the limit. You have such a huge aircraft weighing up to almost 80 tons, and moving this over slippery surfaces can be very challenging, and if an aircraft like this starts breaking out and starts skidding, it is very, very hard to stop it again. Also take into account that you will need a little bit of time in order to break your aircraft down. So we can see right now we are going in 5 knots, but I'm not going to do rapid braking maneuvers as that increases the likelihood of skidding the aircraft. So in the optimal case, I'll just go to idle thrust and let the airplane roll out. So that requires a little bit of anticipation. Did I say anticipation? Well, you need to anticipate that your aircraft will need a bit of time, but now look at how I'm slowly reducing the taxi speed. Okay. We're at the holding point, our parking brake is set, now let's go ahead with our procedures. As soon as it is evident that we will not encounter any additional delay for our takeoff, we are going to start with our flap configuration check, so this is going to take a little bit of time. We will take the flaps all the way to the 40 position. Now closely look at the flap indicator to make sure that the flaps are moving smoothly. This is the only situation in which, if the flaps should ever stop at a certain position, you would reselect the flap lever to the position that matches the actual flap position the closest. So in the air, if you do have a flap malfunction, never ever just move the flap lever without the checklist instructing you to do so. Or in other words, as they love to say, there are no memory items associated with flap problems. On the ground during icing conditions this is different. So now they've reached the 40 position. Let's put them back in the up. So on the ground this is different. On the ground, if the flaps ever stop at a certain position, then you would immediately select the flap lever to the associated position in order to avoid damage from occurring to the flaps and the flap motors. So there is a different logic that applied between ground operations and flight operations. Okay, we've now ensured that our flaps are fully operating, so let's select the takeoff flap position, which in our case is going to be flaps 5. At this point you would also carry out the flight control check and be aware that the control column forces might be increased over here. So if your airplane has the flight control display, do bring it up. If not, like the majority of 737s does not have it, because you have that mechanical connection. Let's go ahead and check our flight controls. Full up, full down, neutral, full left, full right, neutral, and the rudders, full left, full right, neutral. Okay, from here on we carry out the normal before takeoff checklist, and once lineup clearance is received, we are going to line our airplane up on the runway, and we have one final thing to consider during that procedure. So let's go ahead, assume we have just gotten our lineup clearance and our takeoff clearance. The first thing you need to do is to advise ATC that you will take some extra time on the runway, as you do need to carry out some additional procedures there. And these additional procedures basically are the ice shedding procedure, which I'm going to talk about in a few moments. Look at how there are some reflections coming from the runway, so we can see how that runway is definitely slippery at the moment. I just noticed I went a little bit fast at 10 knots there, so I have reduced my taxi speed again, and I am going to keep it reduced for the remainder of the lineup as well. Okay, we are on the runway. Winter operations is often associated with low visibility conditions, and right now the visibility is alright, but it is varying slightly every now and then, so a quick reminder here: if you do encounter low visibility conditions, you need to tune the ILS frequency of the runway that you're on. In our case that is 110.9, and we do verify that we are exactly on the localizer up here. That is very important in case you have parallel runways where you might have lined up on an incorrect runway, like that accident with the 747 in Asia, where they lined up on a closed runway and ran into construction on the takeoff run. So be very careful when you are doing this. Okay, the next procedure that we have to carry out in case the airplane has been exposed to precipitation or to freezing precipitation for a longer time is our ice shedding procedure. And ice accumulation of the engine inlet, spinner and fan blades and stationary vanes must be managed and removed. Heavy precipitation, dense freezing fog or blowing snow can all result in engine inlet, compressor core or fan contamination and icing. This contamination can occur prior to engine start or during arrival and departure taxi operations with the engines running. Should engine core or fan ice be suspected after engines are started, the fan ice removal procedure must be carried out during taxi out and prior to takeoff. So, there is a slight difference there between the 737 NG and the MAX, but we are only going to cover the NG right here, right now. In freezing conditions, with conditions likely to cause fan blade or engine core icing during taxi, such as freezing fog, heavy snow, freezing rain and blowing snow, do the following. With the engines running for an accumulated total time of less than 30 minutes, if engines were de-iced prior to taxi out, no special procedure required during taxi. If the engines were not de-iced before taxi out, or if significant engine vibration is observed, perform a 30-second run-up to 70%. So, we are going to have a look into the engine vibrations real quick over here, and we can see on the left side we have 1.0, on the right side 0.5. Now that is not significant, but nonetheless, let us still carry out the procedure to be on the safe side. If the engines were running for an accumulated total time of more than 30 minutes, always perform the 30 seconds run up to 70%. And high vibration can be expected during the engine run up due to asymmetric shedding and before all the ice has been removed. Vibration levels should return to normal before a takeoff is initiated. Note: fan blade ice buildup is cumulative. If the fan spinner and fan blades were not de-iced prior to taxi out, the time the engines were operating during taxi in should be included within the 30 or 60 minute interval. So, the following procedure is going to increase situational awareness and prevent the aircraft from moving accidentally. So, just to be entirely clear here, if the runway is slippery, then running the engines at 70% might make the aircraft moving. If that happens, continue into a takeoff and forget about the ice shedding procedure. The engines are designed to take the stress, however, it is better for the engines to take things slow. So, release parking brakes and apply foot brakes firmly. Ensure the area behind the airplane is clear, and the pilot on the left-hand seat is going to set the thrust manually and look outside, while the pilot on the right-hand seat is going to start timing for 30 seconds. Okay, so let's go ahead with it. For flight sim operations, we need to simplify things a little bit, so one pilot has to do it all, so just be very sure that you are actually standing on your brakes fully applied. And if the airport conditions and all the aircraft in the vicinity do not permit the engine thrust level to be increased to 70% N1, then set a thrust and timing consistent to the conditions. For example, when operating on a taxiway or runway where there are puddles of de-icing or anti-icing fluid, or for example when operating on slippery and contaminated surfaces. In many cases, it may be appropriate to line up when cleared and perform the engine run-up on the runway in conjunction with the takeoff. And caution, runway de-ice agents may cause brief odor in the cabin or cockpit. The odor quickly clears on takeoff, so inform the cabin crew prior to dispatch when you anticipate this to happen. When operating in conditions of freezing rain, freezing drizzle, freezing fog or heavy snow, run-ups to a minimum of 70% N1 for approximately 1 second duration at intervals of no greater than 10 minutes enhances ice shedding and keeps the engines free of barrel icing and runway ice downstream of the heated engine cowl intakes. So, we are going to do the static run-up just prior to takeoff, and we will turn directly into the takeoff procedure from this. Alright. The requirement for a static run-up prior to takeoff must be coordinated with air traffic control, especially at high-intensity runway operations airports, and communicated in advance of accepting a line-up clearance to ensure arriving traffic is not accepted. So, let's say for example, when you're at the holding point, ATC clears you to line up, then you are going to tell them something like, PMDG 737, line up runway 1 for left, we will need 30 seconds on the runway for ice shedding. And it may be that ATC cancels your lineup clearance for that, in case arriving traffic is too close already. So, with all of that said, let's go ahead And startup procedure, just a quick reminder, the Boeing Supplementary Procedures section in the AFCOM 16.10 states a 30-second run-up is highly recommended wherever possible. However, no minimum time is stated, and the takeoff roll may begin once stable operation is confirmed. Do note, the lower display unit should remain deselected when initiating the static engine run-up. Any secondary engine parameter that exceeds normal operating range during the startup run-up will cause the secondary engine indications to display. Once again, do remember that engine vibrations may indicate above normal operating range up to the maximum display value during ice shedding. However, this will have no adverse effect on the engine. So with all of that said and done, let's go ahead and let's actually go flying. So this is the way how we actually conduct the run-up. Set your engines to 40% and wait for them to stabilize. Once again, keep the brakes pressed. Now we're going to set 70%. Start the timing. And we are going to keep this thrust setting for a period of 30 seconds. What happens right now is that the engines are running so quickly that any ice that has accumulated on the engine fan blades is just going to break off the fan blades. It may be a good idea to inform the passengers over a PA prior to carrying this out, as it will feel quite uncomfortable to them. Okay, we're completed that 30 seconds. The secondary engine display has not come up. Let's start the timing, and from here, 70% stabilized, set takeoff thrust. Takeoff thrust set, indications normal. $80 knots. You're up. On air. Command A. Fuck up. Our speed is actually quite a bit faster than the initial restriction for the turn, but let's say this is acceptable for today. Flaps 1. Alternatively, you could keep your flaps out in 1 and keep the speed down low due to the speed restriction on our SID, but that shall not play a major role for us today for the purpose of this tutorial, so let's go ahead and retract our flaps. Okay, let's assume ATC has just cleared us up to flight level 100. We have ensured that we are going to clear any of those altitude restrictions, so let's go ahead and delete that initial climb restriction. And we have flaps up, no lights. VNAV, set standard, passing 40, climbing 100 after takeoff checklist. The after takeoff checklist we're going to carry out equals the normal checklist, and in flight we only need to take a few certain things into consideration for our anti-icing operations, which I'm going to talk about in a few moments. We can see it's already getting quite bright up there, so chances are we are actually going to leave those snowy conditions in a few moments. So let's talk about when we need to use our anti-ice in flight. And in flight, there is a rather easy rule in the climb and a rather easy rule in the descent as well. In the climb, you need to turn on the engine anti-ice whenever you are in temperatures of 10 degrees or less, showing on the TAT gauge up here. And there is visible moisture outside. Right now we are in clouds, those definitely count as visible moisture. So we have to use anti-ice. Use engine anti-ice only, and only if ice is actually accumulating on the wings, you are going to use the wing anti-ice. In other words, the wing anti-ice actually acts as a de-icer and not as an anti-icing tool. Once again, the difference between the two is that de-icing means actually removing ice, while anti-icing only means preventing ice from accumulating on the airplane. So, we are currently skipping through the last pieces of clouds, so we will hopefully be in conditions where we no longer need the anti-ice in a moment, and we are right now. So since we've left the icing area, we can switch the engine anti-ice off, illuminate watch the valve going bright and dim, and as soon as the engine anti-ice is off, we will select our engine start switches to off as well. There is one exception to the rule for using engine anti-ice in the climb, and that is when the temperature has fallen so low that ice can no longer stick to the airplane, and that is the case when you have a static air temperature of minus 40 degrees or less. You can find this on the progress page, number 2, so go in progress, next page, and up here you have the static air temperature. When this one is below minus 40 and you're in the climb, you no longer need your anti-ice, so you can switch the engine anti-ice off at this point. In the descent, things work a little bit different. When we are descending, we need to turn the engine anti-ice on regardless of what the static air temperature is. So even if you're in cruise flight in the clouds, you start your descent, then you might want to turn on the engine anti-ice immediately, provided the TAT is below minus 10 degrees. This will conclude the current look at our departure, so let's just go ahead for the purpose of a demonstration and look at the arrival procedures as well. Welcome back a little bit later throughout the day, and we are now flying back towards Cologne and have just started our descent towards VIPA from where we are going to fly a standard ILS approach for runway 14 left. Weather conditions in Cologne have still not improved, so we still have snow, minus 5 degrees in limited visibility. So the weather conditions are just about within the Category 1 limits, so we are going to conduct an ILS Cat 1 approach into Cologne. And here is the approach chart for the approach that we are going to do. A quick word before we quickly discuss the approach setup. We are about to enter some clouds in the descent. We can see the temperature is minus 10 degrees up here, so let's turn on the engine anti-ice. Talking about the setup of the approach, it is important that you do enter all this information in the VNAV descent page and the forecast page. So make sure you have ISA deviation and any altitude where you might need the thermal anti-ice inserted in here. In our case, I expect to use the anti-ice from flight level 80 till the ground, so that's what I have entered in here. So let's quickly talk about the other things that we have to consider in this approach. Once again, this is the approach chart for us today. We can see the highest MSA is still 3,800, so applying the cold temperature corrections that we have used earlier on, we can see our MSA is going to be something in the region of 4,200 feet rounded up. So anything below that does need to be corrected. So looking into all the corrections that I have done, anything below the MSA is applicable. So in our case, VIPA VOR 3,000 feet above becomes 3,290. And that goes all the way through to the final approach fix of leg 2. And then we have our outer marker, which should be around 1,100 feet above the ground. And we have added 170 feet for that as well. Also be aware of the minimums. We can see we have 430 feet by default. And if we do have a look into the cold temperature correction chart, then we will see that the minimum is 200 feet above the ground. So minus 10 degrees, 200 feet gives us 20 feet extra. So we add 20 feet to the minimums that has been published in the approach chart, which, looking at this, it's 430 published and we've made it 450 feet. Also be aware that we do need to correct our missed approach altitude. So for this missed approach we go straight ahead 2.8 miles from KBO or 2000, whichever is later. Now we cannot correct these 2000 feet conditional waypoints up here, so we'll just have to take it from there. And then we go to Vipper, climb the 3000, but since that is below the MSA, let us apply the correction. So just as over here, we're going to take 3290, in other words 3300 feet for our missed approach. In real life, ATC would be familiar with those called temperature correction requirements, so air traffic control would expect you to correct the missed approach altitude. On VATSIM or other online networks, however, chances are that ATC will not be aware or will not be familiar with those called altitude temperature corrections. Therefore, it is a good idea to advise them that you are going to change the missed approach altitude of your approach in case you do have to go around. So there is no phraseology published for that, so I would, for example, just say PMDG 738, in case of missed approach, we will climb to an altitude of 3,300 feet due to cold temperature corrections. That is something that controllers online may or may not understand, but it is very important that we do consider this. The next thing that is important for us, however, is when to use anti-ice on the descent. So as I explained earlier, we are going to turn the engine anti-ice on whenever we anticipate to enter icing conditions. We can see right now there are some clouds everywhere around, while technically speaking we are not in IMC yet, but just looking outside we are about to enter it. So I've already turned the engine anti-ice on. The wing anti-ice at this moment, however, does remain off, because do remember, we use wing anti-ice only to remove ice that has already built up on our aircraft and not to prevent any ice from building up. If you use wing anti-ice to prevent ice building up on your aircraft, then all that is going to happen is that this ice is going to melt when it hits the leading edge. It flows backwards onto the areas that are not heated, and then it freezes over there, and you have no chance of removing that. So do remember, we use wing anti-ice only to remove ice that has already accumulated on the aircraft. And what we can do for that is to have a look at the wiper up here. When ice accumulates on your airplane, you are going to see it on the wiper. In real life, you will mostly see it over here at the screws and on the bottom of the actual wiper blade. Due to limitations in Microsoft Flight Simulator, it will be the entire wiper that is going to show you ice effects. Nonetheless, when you do see some ice building up here, chances are you will have icing on your wing as well, and therefore want to use anti-ice. When you do use the wing anti-ice, flick it on like this, but be aware that once you have used wing anti-ice, your minimum maneuver speed is going to increase. So you can see how it has increased down here already, and this is because while we do have anti-ice available for the leading edge flaps, so looking at the wing up here, we can see the wing is divided in different parts. We have the leading edge flaps, which are not de-iced. Then we have our numbers 2, 3 and 4 leading edge flaps, which are de-iced, and the outboard one again is not de-iced. The entire tailplane is not de-iced either. Therefore, once we have actually used our wing anti-ice, the minimum maneuver speed on the PFD is going to stay increased above the normal values. So do anticipate that on the approach, and do anticipate that you will be closer to the stall speed, or rather closer to the indicated stall speed. This is independent of the length of your actual flight, so you can expect that even if you do a 4-hour flight down to somewhere where it is very warm, 30 degrees or so, the airplane is still going to give you the increased stall speed indication once wing anti-ice has been used. When you do use wing anti-ice, turn it on for maybe a minute or two, look out at the wing, see how the ice is actually flying away, and then we can immediately switch it back off. So VNAV's coming in a little bit high over here, let me help it out. Approach mode is armed. Flaps 5. So from here on, basically we are just going to follow the normal approach procedures. And I do know that you guys like seeing me fly approaches, so that's why I am going to fly this entire approach for you. Be aware, we have passed to beam our final approach fix and see how our altitude has been higher than 3,000 feet at that position. I do have to say, in Microsoft Flight Simulator at the moment, the effect does not seem to be as great as in real life. So in real life, when you're passing the FAF over here, at temperatures like we have them right now, you could see, you would really see something like 3,300 or so on the altimeters. On the sim, that does not seem to be quite the case yet. However, there is some sort of an effect, and Asobo is likely still working on it, so that's why I do already put great emphasis on including these cold temperature corrections at the moment. Let's help us a bit. Flaps 10. We're approaching a 5-mile range. Gear down. Flap 15. Landing checklist. Once again, entirely standard checklist here. Start switch is continuous, recall, check, speed brake on, green light, landing gear down 3 green, auto brake 3 set. Okay, let's go flap 25 intermediate. And flaps 30, complete the landing checklist. Flaps 30, 30, green lights. Landing lights on as soon as we're clear to land. And we're stable, passing through 1,000 feet. Checked. Okay, we can see something downstairs, even though it's only a little bit of snowy forest right now. In snowy conditions, typically the visibility is greatly reduced, so being able to see a runway early is something that you really should put an emphasis on. By selecting a little bit higher height for your view, or in real life by just putting your seat into a higher position, you can really help achieving this. Okay, approach lights are in sight.
Plus 100.
Disconnecting. Continue. And we do want to make a positive landing here, so that our ground spoilers come out quickly, and that the effect of the thrust reverses can engage as quick as possible. The thrust reverses in contaminated runway conditions make the majority of your braking actions, so it may be very, very difficult to get your airplane to slow down just by using the wheel brakes of your aircraft. You can see right now, we landed within the touchdown zone, but it was almost impossible to vacate the runway early on, so that's why we are currently rolling on towards the end of the runway, or rather towards a further exit than what we would usually take. Talking about getting towards the end of the runway, there have been a couple of runway excursions already that related to a specific rule, and here it is. So typically the first and second third of the runway, so the first 2/3, may be well cleared from any contaminants or snow. But the last third of the runway is rarely used because aircraft will usually be airborne before that, or will usually vacate runways earlier than that last third. So here's the problem. That last third, because it is so rarely used, might be in a significantly worse condition than the actual first 2/3 of the runway. Therefore, when you are having an airplane roll to the end of the runway, be sure to keep those thrust reversers out until you really are, until your stopping really is assured. Until you are really sure that you can stop. That is what I wanted to say. Sorry. So, there have been a couple accidents, and let me just name one of those. A European operator that flew Boeing 737-800 into a Polish airport at some point in the winter from 2021 to 2022 had to roll out all the way to the end. The crew, aware of the bad contaminated condition of the runway, initially slowed the airplane down to a proper speed of approximately 40 knots, about halfway through on the runway. And in this time they figured out the runway had a good braking action and they could brake the airplane without any problems. However, they had to roll all the way to the end. And while the crew has been rolling all the way to the end, they reduced the speed to approximately 30 knots. And then when they approached the taxiway to vacate the runway at the end, they tried to slow the airplane down any further. However, they had already stowed their thrust reversers. They applied the wheel brakes and they simply did nothing. The runway was so slippery towards its end that the entire aircraft just slipped over the runway end and it was impossible to brake it to a standstill, even though they were just at 30 knots and they had about 500 meters of runway remaining at that point. Full wheel brakes did nothing, the thrust reversers took far too long to come out, and that's how in the end they slipped off the runway and ended up in the grass and the approach light system. So, that pretty much concludes our winter operations tutorial series. There is one more thing that I just want to talk about while we are taxiing along right now, and that is a wing light. In other aircraft it might be called an ice light. In any case, it serves the same purpose. And in order to understand what this light is meant for and what not, we just have to switch over to some night conditions. So here we are, at night, and the wing light is exclusively used to determine if we need to anti-ice our wings, or rather if we need to activate the wing anti-ice. So, in a typical condition at night, looking over there, we can see pretty much nothing on the leading edge of our wing. And that's what we use the wing light for. If we switch this on, you can see that now the leading edge of the wing is actually illuminated. And now it is possible to determine if there is ice on it or not. So that is the exclusive use of those wing or ice lights, depending on what they're called, depending on the aircraft type that you are flying. So that shall conclude the tutorial about winter operations. I hope that you have learned a lot from it, and I do very much look forward to see what you have to say about it. If there are things that your operator is doing different if you are a real pilot as well, or how you did things as a simulator pilot. I would like to thank you very much for sticking with me for such a long and extensive tutorial. It is a lot of stuff, but do believe me, my airline does extensive preparations for winter operations every single day that we or every single season, and those courses literally take hours and hours of stuff that us real pilots have to revise before operating in winter conditions for the first time at the beginning of every single season. Thank you very much for joining. I hope that you have enjoyed today, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on a future tutorial. If you do want to support the channel, leave a like, comment and subscribe, and if you really like what I'm doing, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me a Coffee link, which you can find in the video description below. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.